Welcome to Dusky Lore. Close your eyes, dim the lights, and listen closely as the shadows begin to speak. All of tonight's stories have one thing in common: a Ouija board. However, we are not talking about the kind you can buy at a toy store, but homemade versions. The boards featured in today's stories were drawn on sheets of notebook paper, carved into pieces of wood, and used with a coin, a shot glass, or any other object that could serve as a planchette. They are completely homemade boards, but whether it is a Hasbro Ouija board or one made by hand, the difference does not matter very much. A Ouija board is still a Ouija board. Since the late 19th century, many people have used them in an attempt to communicate with the dead. Unfortunately for them, something often ends up answering, and that is precisely where tonight's stories begin. 5 different people, 5 different encounters, 5 warnings that the spirit world does not care whether you bought the board or built it yourself. Once you open the door, you do not get to decide who or what walks through it. These are the stories you sent us about what can happen when you invite something inside using nothing more than a homemade Ouija board. The first story was submitted by a woman named Aisha. She is now 42 years old, but everything happened when she was only 11. Her mother's name was Rose. When Aisha was that age, Rose was sadly diagnosed with colon cancer. In addition to the illness, the family was going through serious financial problems. Not knowing what else to do, they eventually moved into the home of Lola, one of Rose's friends. The house was completely full. Lola had several teenage children and others who had just entered their 20s. Each had a bedroom of their own, and some also lived there with their partners. Because there was so little space, Aisha spent many nights sleeping on a sofa bed beside one of Lola's daughters. With so many people under the same roof and none of them having much money, practically everyone worked. They also had to find inexpensive ways to entertain themselves. One night, Rose and Lola decided to make their own Ouija board. As a planchette, they used a piece from another game. Aisha became curious and secretly watched them play, although at first they did not appear to be getting any results. They later claimed to have made contact with a little boy who said he lived in the house. They closed the session, said goodbye properly, and did not give it much thought. Aisha believes both women suspected that the other one was moving the planchette as a prank. Sometime later, they brought out the homemade board again. That was when the situation began to turn unsettling. The planchette moved quickly in every direction and spelled out all kinds of messages. Rose finally said, "This is fake. There is no possible way this is real." Lola suggested a test. Then ask it a question in your mind without saying it out loud, and we'll see whether it can answer you. Rose agreed, thinking she had nothing to lose by trying. She formed the question silently without sharing it with anyone else. Immediately, the planchette began spelling out an answer. 2.5 years. Rose shoved the board away and said the whole thing was complete nonsense. When Lola insisted on knowing what she had asked, Rose admitted that she wanted to know how much time she had left to live. Years later, the family would realize that the answer had been correct. Rose died approximately 2.5 years afterward. However, what happened that night was even worse. Rose had been weakened by her medication. As she sat there, she began to fall asleep. Her hands moved and gave small jerks, as though she were continuing to use the Ouija board while sleeping. Lola was a very superstitious woman, and she told everyone not to wake her. Don't wake her. Let her sleep. When Rose finally opened her eyes, she was crying. Everyone began asking her what was wrong. Rose explained that she had dreamed she was visiting her boyfriend, who was incarcerated at the time. At first, the two of them were separated by a glass panel. Suddenly, the glass disappeared and they both found themselves inside an entirely white room. There was a table in the center of the room, and a Ouija board rested on top of it. On the other side of the room stood an extremely attractive and desirable man. Aisha explained that according to the beliefs of her culture, when the devil presents himself to a woman, he usually takes the appearance of a seductive man. For that reason, even within the dream, Rose immediately understood that she was standing before the devil. The man told her, "Come with me, Rose. You won't have to suffer anymore. The cancer will disappear, and you will no longer feel pain. Come with me." Rose refused the invitation. No, I don't think I'm going to do that. Her boyfriend intervened. No, Rosemary, you're staying with me. Then the man made another proposal. Why don't you use the Ouija board to decide? Play with it a little longer and decide whether you want to come with me or stay by his side. Rose cried as she told them about the dream, and later that same night, everything became worse again. At around 3 in the morning, Aisha and the daughter of Lola with whom she shared the sofa bed woke up. They both heard country music coming from the laundry room. They went to see what was happening and noticed that the clock was blinking 12 o'clock. Meanwhile, a radio filled with static continued playing country music. The two of them turned it off and returned to bed. They considered checking on Rose, but assumed she would be fine because she was sleeping in the bedroom of another one of Lola's daughters. The next morning, Rose had deep red scratches running across her neck. Lola's daughter, who had slept beside her, said that she had awakened during the night after hearing Rose plead, "No, leave me alone. Leave me alone." At the same time, Rose's nightgown was thrashing violently, as though invisible hands were pulling at the fabric. The girl became so terrified that she told her, "Rose, we have to take you to a church." Rose answered her in a voice that did not seem to belong to her. "I'm not going to any damn church." Needless to say, they did take her the following day. As soon as Rose came face to face with the crucifix, she fell to her knees. She sweated and cried uncontrollably as she repeatedly submerged her hands and face in the holy water. At one point, she completely soaked her head. As she did so, she felt something being sucked out from inside her stomach. It was as though a dark, tangible, and real presence were being pulled from her body each time she covered herself with that water. When they finally left the church, Rose was still crying. They asked her why, and she explained that she had heard a man's voice. The voice assured her that she had lived a very difficult life, but that all her actions had been forgiven. When the time came for her to leave, she would be welcomed with love, rest in peace, and be completely forgiven. Fortunately, the dark presence Rose had experienced stopped bothering her. Nevertheless, something else happened 1 month before her death. Aisha had fallen asleep beside her mother's hospital bed when Rose looked at her and warned, "Aisha, don't move." After a few moments, she asked her to turn on the light. Rose told her that she had seen an angel floating above her daughter's head. The angel looked at Aisha, then looked at Rose and said, "Let her go. Everything is all right. She will be fine. You can let yourself go now." Aisha said her mother died 6 months before she turned 14. Exactly 2.5 years had passed since the diagnosis, just as the Ouija board had predicted. She also explained that her family continues to experience strange events. Her daughter says she can see things, although they try to connect those experiences with the light rather than the darkness. When her niece was younger, she also claimed that she could speak with Rose. Aisha ended her email by writing, "Maybe we are a gifted family that is too afraid to use our abilities, or perhaps we are simply a family haunted by something. But there is one thing I know for certain. My mother was possessed the night we used that Ouija board. I don't know what to think, guys. This is one of the most chilling Ouija board stories I have ever read. The first time I opened the email and learned what happened, I felt genuine chills." The next story belongs to Ava, who says that she has been sensitive to certain presences that other people cannot see ever since she was very young. During her childhood, her parents were incarcerated. Because of that, she spent much of her early life living with her grandparents. They were extremely conservative and religious, and they lived in one of the oldest houses in town. Before they moved in, the house had been stripped down until the 2x4 wooden framework was exposed. It was then completely rebuilt. Ava explained, "I was about 3 years old when I arrived at that house. That was when the experiences began." She remembers waking up one night and seeing red eyes glowing against the wall. Not long afterward, when she was about 4, she quietly left her bedroom because she wanted to climb into her grandparents' bed. However, as she passed the dining room, she saw them. They were 2 little girls who looked exactly like her. They wore the same dress her mother was wearing in a family photograph hanging on the wall. One had her hair styled in 2 low braids, while the other wore 2 high ponytails. The girls ran and laughed through the hallway. They jumped and held onto the door frames, but they never stopped staring directly at Ava. Sometime later, her brother admitted that he had seen them too. Not much later, Ava opened her bedroom door in the middle of the night and looked toward the kitchen. Beside the refrigerator was a crouching creature that she can only describe as a cross between a crab and a spider. The creature was holding a gallon of milk and drinking directly from it. When it realized Ava was watching, she slammed the door shut and ran to her bed. Ava says that strange situations always seemed to follow her. As she grew up, an older cousin often babysat her. Years later, that cousin told her that one night, after Ava had fallen asleep, she watched 3 of Ava's My Little Pony toys stand up and begin walking across the floor without anyone touching them. Ava constantly spoke to people who were not there. She would stare at and listen to things no one else could perceive. She also had a particular obsession with the dryer and repeatedly said that something lived inside it. Looking back on those years, Ava said, "Now I believe I was telling the truth. I remember that there really was something inside that dryer." When she entered her teenage years, the manifestation stopped for quite some time. Everything remained relatively calm, and she came to believe that those experiences had been limited to her childhood. But the phenomena returned when she moved into her father's house. On the first day, while she stood on a chair hanging curtains in her bedroom, she saw it. There was a man-shaped figure on the sidewalk watching her through the window. It had short curly hair, was shirtless, and she could make out the outline of a pair of shorts. It did not move. It did not even blink. There was a church across the street and a hospital a little farther down. However, the street was completely empty. Ava felt absolute terror. She jumped down from the chair and ran to tell her father what had happened. He went outside to look for the supposed stranger, but found no one. From that corner property, nearly the entire street was visible, so it would have been difficult for a person to disappear that quickly. Ava did not believe him and decided to check for herself, but she saw nothing either. Unfortunately, that was only the beginning. One day, Ava made the reckless decision to use an improvised Ouija board with her younger brother. After that session, the boy's bedroom door began opening every night at exactly 10 o'clock, whether he was inside the room or not. From her bedroom across the hall, Ava would open her own door and watch as her brother's door moved slowly, creaking as it opened by itself. It happened with clockwork precision. Both of them knew it would happen again night after night. Then the episodes of sleep paralysis began. Ava saw shadows leaning over her while a crushing force pressed against her chest. She felt that something was holding her still and that she could not move any part of her body. This continued for nearly a year. Then the entity appeared. One night she dreamed that she was sitting on her bed. At its foot was a chair angled slightly toward her and positioned beside the closet door. When she opened her eyes, she discovered that something was sitting in that same chair. It had no face. She could only make out long black hair, a red t-shirt, and blue jeans. Ava was speaking to the figure. She does not remember exactly what words she was saying, but at one point the entity reached out its arms and pulled her. She woke up screaming. Her body had been dragged across the comforter and sheets. Her feet were hanging off the bed, directly in front of the chair. Much later, when she was already an adult, she posted some of her stories in a TikTok video. After doing so, she had another dream. Someone appeared and began speaking to her about that entity. The person explained, "Its size within your life will depend on how much energy you give it. It can be as small as 13 inches, grow until it reaches the size of a young child, or become as tall as the largest human being who has ever existed." Ava asked, "What is it?" The person replied, "You already know perfectly well what it is. The only way to make it disappear is to give it no energy at all." To this day, no member of Ava's family has seen exactly the same thing she has. Nevertheless, she is convinced that the entity has followed her from childhood into adulthood, and she does not know what to do to stop it. That is why she decided to share her experience. If you have any advice or words you would like to share with her, you can leave them in the comments. Before beginning the next story, I want to give you a warning. Some people find it extremely uncomfortable to hear the name I am about to mention. For narrative reasons, I will have to say it. but it is the name of an alleged demon, Zozo. If this makes you uncomfortable, you can skip directly to the next story. That is the warning. Even among people who have experience using Ouija boards, I think it is worth remembering a few rules. I do not personally play with them. This is only what I have learned. Set clear boundaries. Seriously set boundaries. If Zozo appears during the session, it is not a friendly spirit. It may behave like one at first, but it is not. This is Trina's story. I am going to share what she wrote in full detail to avoid getting anything wrong. When she was between 14 and 15 years old, Trina began spending time with a group of friends who were a few years older than she was. They were all interested in paranormal phenomena, but one of the young women, Amanda, was much bolder and felt drawn to considerably darker things. Another one of her friends, Morgan, often told them stories about her family's paranormal experiences. Morgan's father practiced black magic in Mexico, so Trina tended to believe her when she spoke about strange events. Amanda owned an old Ouija board that she had purchased at a garage sale. None of them had ever used one before, so they agreed that she would bring it the first time they all gathered together. However, when the night arrived, Amanda forgot to bring it. They did not want to waste the opportunity, so they made a board out of a pizza box. It was close to 11 at night, and they were inside an old house that belonged to Morgan's aunt. The electricity had been disconnected. Their only sources of light were their phone flashlights and a couple of Bath and Body Works candles. The improvised board did not work, so they decided to try a seance. They even offered a piece of pizza, as though that might help attract a spirit. Amanda and Morgan went to the bathroom and then stepped outside to wait in the car. The rest of the group stayed inside, repeating chants and waiting for some kind of sign. Nothing happened, so they decided to leave. As they walked down the stairs, Trina looked toward the bathroom and froze. A little girl was crouched in one of the corners. At first, she thought Amanda and Morgan were trying to scare them. Then she saw the car's lights outside. The girl's vehicle was already running. Everyone ran to the car in terror. Amanda and Morgan were screaming too. They claimed they had heard a phone ringing in the back seat. It played one of those old ringtones that none of them still used in 2014. They also swore they had heard a man's voice. Later, Morgan's aunt told them that a friend of her daughter's, who was a medium, had sensed that a little girl died in a fire inside that house. The fire had supposedly started in the bathroom. They returned to the property the following morning. All the mirrors had been shattered, and several of the candles they had left there were broken as well. The house was still completely locked. That should have been enough to make them abandon the experiment, but it was not. The following weekend, they gathered again, this time at the home of Morgan's aunt's boyfriend. The man told them that he had lost a baby to sudden infant death syndrome in one of the upstairs bedrooms, although he insisted the house was not haunted. They waited until after midnight, lit the candles, and used the real Ouija board. The first question was, "Is anyone here?" The planchette slid to yes. "Will you answer some questions?" "Yes." "What is your name?" The answer was, Zozo. They asked the question again and received exactly the same name, Zozo. They all knew what it meant. They panicked, broke the rules, and took their hands off the board. When they placed them back on it and tried to say goodbye, the situation only grew worse. That night they heard someone running around upstairs. They were the only people awake. From that point forward, new phenomena occurred every time they visited the house. Unexplained noises, children's laughter, doors slamming violently, and footsteps pounding the floor above their heads. On one occasion, Morgan's cousin was walking up the stairs when something pulled her hair so hard that it jerked her backwards several steps. Everyone witnessed it happen. The paranormal activity followed them for months. One night, while they were at Morgan's house, they used a quarter as a kind of pendulum or improvised planchette. They began asking questions that could be answered with a yes or a no. Eventually, they dared to challenge the presence. "Can you give us a sign inside the bedroom?" They gave it 10 minutes to do so. At the 8-minute mark, the PlayStation console turned on without anyone touching it. The television immediately turned on as well. It was an old flat screen that could not be activated that way. Someone had to physically press the button. Morgan's younger brother eventually got rid of the coin. He threw it into some random student's locker at school. As for the Ouija board, Amanda became frightened and gave it to Morgan. Sometime later, Morgan's mother, a deeply religious woman, found it and threw it in the trash. She thought that would put an end to everything. A few days later, she stormed into Morgan's room and demanded to know who had taken the board out of the trash. She had found it wedged between the house's back door and the outer security door. No one admitted to touching it. Morgan's mother soaked it in holy water and then burned it. That may have been the end for that family, but it was not the end for Trina. Unexplained events began occurring inside her home. The lights flickered and the doors vibrated. At night, she heard someone running up and down the stairs, even though everyone else was asleep. Her doorknob rattled with tremendous force, as though someone were trying to force their way inside. Then the scratches appeared, always grouped in sets of 3. They were so deep that other people noticed them. Trina could not have caused them accidentally because she always wore acrylic nails. That activity continued to follow her for years. It only stopped when she was approximately 17 or 18. Trina is now 26 and has not experienced anything like it again. She is honestly grateful. She likes to believe that she is no longer open to those kinds of phenomena, although she will never be able to forget the things that began the night they made a Ouija board out of a pizza box. That story genuinely gave me chills when I read it. I managed to scare myself and could not stop looking over my shoulder while I was inside my house. The next story is very sad. It was submitted by a woman named Dolly. Dolly wrote, I grew up in El Monte, California. When I was 12 years old, my sister Wendy brought home a handmade Ouija board. I'm 38 now, but I still remember that night perfectly. They began by asking the usual questions. What is your name? How long have you been here? The entity responded to everyone except Karina, one of Dolly's sisters. For some reason, it seemed to dislike her. Dolly does not remember the name it gave them, but she has never forgotten what it told her brother Joe. It ordered him to go to Los Angeles and meet it at the intersection of 2 streets whose names Dolly can no longer remember. He was supposed to appear on a specific date that was fairly close. It also explained how he would be able to recognize it. It would be disguised as a woman and would have red hair, lips painted the same color, and a red dress as well. Then it issued this threat. If you don't show up, I will come for you when you are 33. Joe decided not to go to the meeting. The group continued asking questions until their older brother entered the room and announced that he was going to tell their father. As soon as he closed the door, the planchette began moving by itself. It spelled out a message that said, "Take care of him." The order meant that they should go after their brother, beat him, or hurt him. At that moment, their father entered the room completely furious and demanded that they burn the board. They obeyed him. However, things grew worse after they destroyed it. On some nights, Dolly woke with a horrible feeling, convinced that someone was watching her. She shared the bedroom with her sisters Wendy and Michelle and her brother Joe. One night, she opened her eyes and saw a dark man-shaped figure standing inside the bedroom. Then the mattress sank beside her feet, as though someone had just sat down there. Dolly woke Wendy and told her that someone was inside the room. Wendy got up and tried to turn on the light, but the switch did not work. Joe woke up as well and checked the light bulb. He discovered that someone had unscrewed it just enough to keep it from turning on. The siblings alerted their parents. When they searched the house, they found the kitchen window completely open and several muddy footprints leading in from outside. During the following weeks, they continued finding more footprints in the backyard. Years passed and they all tried to forget what had happened. When Joe grew up, he moved to Tijuana. One night, the family received a phone call. Joe had been murdered. He was exactly 33 years old. Dolly has not touched a Ouija board since she was 12. After what happened to her brother, she is certain she will never do it again. The final story arrived with the subject line, "The Sound of Silence." I really liked the way Jordan wrote the email, so I am going to share the story while preserving every event that was described. Jordan grew up in a suburb located approximately 25 miles south of Cleveland, Ohio. There were not many options for entertainment. Because of that, like many teenagers during the 2000s and 10s, Jordan and her friends enjoyed exploring abandoned buildings in the surrounding area. First, they had to find those places, which represented half the challenge. Then they would go inside, explore the facilities, take photographs, and examine the many unsettling objects that had remained there as remnants of the past. Jordan's favorite place was an abandoned meat factory. At different points in its history, the building had also served as a nursing home and as a business that manufactured construction signs. It was quite a peculiar combination. Nevertheless, the place they visited most often was an abandoned elementary school located about 20 minutes from their hometown. It was called Richfield Elementary, and it was perfect for their explorations because it stood fairly far from the road. They left their vehicles in the parking lot of the church across the street. Then they ran across an open field, passed through a huge hole in the fence, and finally entered through another hole. This one opened directly in the gymnasium wall. Inside the gymnasium was a stage with bleachers, a rope hanging from the ceiling that only the bravest among them dared to swing from, several pianos, and an enormous number of chairs, desks, tables, and other objects. Apparently, much of the furniture from the classrooms had been stored there before the school was abandoned. They found the place extremely sinister. The vast darkness, shadowy corners, and old pianos they attempted to play all contributed to a deeply unsettling atmosphere. They were convinced the school had paranormal activity. They had heard faint noises in the hallways and the sound of rolling chairs moving across the second-floor surface directly above them. Some friends also claimed to have seen shadows. There was asbestos behind the stage, so they usually moved through the gymnasium quickly. During their high school years, they came to know the entire building very well. Several years passed. Jordan and one of her high school friends were now in their second year at a local liberal arts college. It was a small, quiet institution where anything interesting rarely happened. The old abandoned school was about 20 minutes from campus, so they made a plan. They would bring the high school group back together, take the college kids with them, and show them how fascinating Richfield was. They might also make a Ouija board, and perhaps, just perhaps, they would take that same board to the school. Jordan admits that she knows perfectly well that no one should play with those kinds of things. She did so frequently at the time, but says that after what happened to them, that was the last time she ever used one. Eventually, the group came together. 9 people split between 2 cars and arrived at Richfield at around 10 at night. They brought a few drinks, flashlights, and of course a homemade Ouija board. They would use a small plastic shot glass as the planchette. As Jordan joked, #college. Walking through that school again after so many years made them feel nostalgic. Everything appeared to be exactly as they had left it. That is the interesting thing about abandoned places. Part of their appeal comes from the fact that very few people know they exist, and even fewer would be reckless enough to enter. The group passed through the gymnasium, the teacher's lounge, the front offices, and the cafeteria. Eventually, they decided to settle in what appeared to have been the library, located on the second floor. It was an almost empty room. Shelves lined the perimeter of the walls, and books had been thrown everywhere. Jordan suspected that other teenagers had entered solely to destroy things without facing any consequences, behavior that never interested her group. They pushed several tables together, placed a few sources of light around the board, and prepared to summon the spirits of the school, assuming any actually existed. Several members of the group were skeptical, especially Jordan's boyfriend, who is now her husband. Even so, Jordan hoped something interesting would happen, or something impressive enough to surprise him. The two of them had only just begun their relationship at the time. There they were, 9 friends sharing stories and laughing, surrounded by absolute darkness. The only light was what they had brought with them. The library was silent. However, they could clearly hear the constant chirping of crickets in the field outside because the school's windows were broken and boarded up. This detail is important. They took out the Ouija board, held hands, and said a brief prayer asking for blessing and protection. Then they invited any spirit of light that wanted to communicate to enter the room. What happened next remains for all of them the most terrifying and real experience they have ever had. 3 or 4 members of the group placed 2 fingers on the glass and asked whether anyone wanted to speak with them. The board answered yes. The presence identified itself as Billy and claimed to have been a student at that school. It did not take long before they asked the question that practically everyone wants to ask when using a Ouija board. They wanted proof that it was real. Jordan asked, "Billy, can you prove that you are here?" Billy answered yes. "What will you do to prove that you are really with us?" The planchette began spelling DEAF. It was the English word deaf. As it marked the first few letters, most of them thought it would spell dead or death, English words related to being dead and to death itself. Everyone looked up as the glass touched the final letter, F, and then shot toward the yes option. At that exact moment, the cricket stopped chirping for approximately 3 seconds. An intense white noise struck Jordan's ears, similar to the ringing that remains inside the eardrum after spending an entire night beside a speaker at a concert. Jordan looked at the confused faces of her friends as several of them raised their hands to their ears. Then the crickets began chirping again. Everyone was bewildered. Although 2 of the friends wanted to leave the building immediately, the group decided to try again. It was the first time Jordan had ever experienced anything like it, much less while accompanied by an entire group that could confirm the same phenomenon. Jordan asked, "Oh, Billy, did you just do that?" Billy spelled out, "Yes." Then she asked him, "Can you do it again but make it last longer so we know it was really you?" Billy responded affirmatively. Everyone remained completely still and absolutely silent. This time, as the glass traced circles around the word yes, the sound of the crickets gradually began to fade, as though someone were turning down the volume of the world. The white noise returned with greater intensity. It also lasted much longer than the initial 3 seconds. Jordan looked at one of her friends and saw her lips moving as she said, "What the hell?" But the young woman had not mouthed the words silently. She said them out loud, and yet none of them could hear her. Some members of the group remember the phenomenon lasting around 10 seconds. Others are convinced it lasted between 25 and 30. Jordan only knows that it continued long enough for all of them to believe that someone was altering their ability to hear. She came to think that they would never hear the crickets or any other sound again. At last, the sound of the world returned. The group quickly said goodbye to Billy and turned the board face down. The friends who were already frightened were completely shaken and wanted to leave the building as quickly as possible. One of the girls clutched a rosary in her hands while her eyes filled with tears. The walk to the exit felt far more tense and disturbing than on any of their previous visits. They all had the impression that they had opened some kind of portal that probably, or definitely, should have remained closed. As Jordan walked with the light in front of her and impenetrable darkness behind her, she realized how terrifying the situation truly was. When they reached the gymnasium, they ran out of the building and sought refuge inside their cars. The school was demolished several years later. It was a dangerous place, and Jordan assumes that word eventually spread about how easy it was to get inside. Sometimes she tries to convince herself that it was all a product of her imagination, and that things did not happen exactly that way. However, the experience affected all 9 people who were present, and each of them can still remember that night as though it happened yesterday. Even her husband, who had always been the most skeptical, still describes it as the most terrifying experience of his entire life. Jordan agrees. People often say that our eyes can deceive us, but she never imagined that our ears could play such a cruel trick on us as well. Thank you all so much for listening. I appreciate you being here far more than you could ever imagine.